This is the London Fintech podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London Fintech Podcast, episode 145, brought to you in association with Smart Pension, and we're going to take a 2020 look back at a decade of fintech. I myself founded a tech fintech in the late 1990s before fintech even existed, which on the one hand meant there wasn't a wall of funds around to fund growth, but on the other meant that no one had told me that profit didn't really matter, so I managed to make a good chunk of the old-fashioned concept. In 2013 and 2014, I was doing a fill-in gig for some chums as interim head of marketing for a fintech that didn't even know it was a fintech as they hadn't heard the word. Anyway, before we dive into the decade's timeline, which I've experienced in many ways above and beyond 5.5 years of London Fintech podcasting, let's have a look at the super big picture. Just over half the audience is overseas, and it's been a great year to be overseas, or from your perspective, not on that tiny wet island just off the North Atlantic. In soaking up the business past, I've absorbed more than I ever knew about British history, which actually isn't that hard, as I knew next to nothing other than the names of kings and queens. And it's not just me. Bridget, too, learned next to nothing at school either. And well, we both didn't exactly go to poor schools. We did history, but in my case, O-levels were about the Russian Revolution, the rise of the Nazis, and the origins of the Second World War. Unsurprising and helpful stuff. But not much about ourselves. Is this a strange British thing? Does the 99% of the world that was lucky enough in 2019 not to be British know as little about itself? Let me know, I'm curious. At a local level, I did solve this koan mid-year when I read a fantastic article, link in the show notes. I'll quote, "In the first half of the 19th century, there was little controversy over what was taught, as most young people did not attend school, and those that did were either attending very expensive private, i.e. public, schools, or learning the 3 R's until the age of 11. If you went to the former, you were more likely to study Greek or Roman history than you were any British or imperial history. But of course, the Greek and Roman historical experiences were often used as a substitute and learning aid for the leaders of what would become the British Empire. Parallels were often drawn between the experiences of Roman consuls and emperors and those of British politicians and civil servants. Greek and Roman theories of government were the only form of political discourse entertained for younger minds. The British Empire was regarded as being the heirs to this classical tradition. However, it was hoped that by studying the two classical civilizations, the British might learn from their mistakes and keep their own empire flowering and make it an even more successful empire than the Greeks and Romans had managed. It was by no accident that British colonial architecture and art was far more likely to be influenced by these Mediterranean civilizations than from any local or indigenous cultures that the British came into contact with. All of which is interesting and explains a lot, especially why the classical corridor, albeit small, was at the heart of the school, and why classics was so prestigious, something that seemed a complete mystery to me at the time. This was in the 1970s, and Gramsci's long march through the institutions had no impact upon teaching at that point. Fast forward to the modern UK, and history A-level is all about, quotes, letting pupils think for themselves, unquotes, having given them, of course, an utterly biased and cherry-picked syllabus, roughly along the lines of how bad the British were and how good the American Constitution is. Anyway, last year is history we all know about. In the UK, the dictatorial and incompetent May saw the rise of Home Office Britain, and along with her fellow woke and equally incompetent Mayor Khan, their wokeness saw a huge rise in murdering in London, overtaking New York. The powers that be and mainstream media in both the UK and US, long having left news behind and become propagandists for globalist corporatism, a world fit for Goldman Sachs and Google, for the EU and the UN and the manipulators behind them all of course sprayed with virtue signalling. Having seen more of our history, which absolutely is relevant to why fintech started here, last year seems to be one of the close shaves of which we've had quite a few. Centralised tyranny was a Roman invention on this island. Although simplifying, they weren't too tyrannical and did bring a lot. Britons had a couple of centuries under themselves before mistakenly inviting Anglo-Saxons in to help their local wars. I think we can guess how that went, given the predominance of the Anglo-Saxon term these days. Interestingly, the population increased by some 10%, a figure similar to that initiated by Blair and his now documented desire to import voters, although in the first millennium it took a century or two, not 20 years. The Normans, those half Viking, half French invaders, really got going on centralised tyranny, and it took centuries to shake that off, crossed with evolving them into something else. From the 13th century, Magna Carta onwards, the vibe, and this is the vibe that led to fintech being invented centuries later, was to delegate authority. Law, unlike in Europe, where it is created centrally, was created locally in an ad hoc fashion. Business as around Europe was managed locally, and the 16th century creation of the company was again emphasising the local nature of governance. This delegation, eccentricity and think-for-yourselfness was fundamental in Britain's global expansion. Note our bene wokists, we were colonised far more than we colonised, so please include us in your list of reparations to be paid. Delegation and initiative was fundamental in creating the Industrial Revolution, and it was fundamental in the huge leaps forward in technology in the 20th century. I read a list of the inventions we gave to the US last year as part of mentoring the war. We were well ahead technologically. And ditto in 2005 when Zopa formed. Europe P2P volumes last time I looked were only 10% of the UK's. Once again, the US profited more by being 10 times our market, although as per the spirit of the 21st century, the Chinese were 10 times the Americans. I've mentioned Zopa, who formed in 2005 as the origin of the fintech revolution, as this is the best known example. However, internet-based FS, which is fintech, isn't it, had some earlier precedents. WorldFirst, who we had on the show way back in LFP145, were doing online FX from 2004. But, to the point of reviewing a decade in fintech, both Ratesetter and Funding Circle were founded in 2010. The LFP has been running since 2014, a year when no one much cared about fintech. The Twitter handle, @London Fintech, was free, so I took it. @London Fintech Podcast, taking up half an old-style tweet. 2014 was also the year when a successful fintech week was held in London and the mainstream media started using that word. As I'm only too aware that history is all too often something we create now about what was happening then, rather than myself being biased by presentism, seeing everything from today's perspective, I'll dive back into my show notes written at the time to give us a kind of diary entry of what fintech was, what was big, what was not, and where we all thought it was going at the time. I'll mention the early episodes, but otherwise just touch on some key ones to paint a picture and jog all our memories. It's probably quite useful to start with my brief show notes for LFP001, as they will give you a good feel for the fintech world in London in 2014. As mentioned, stuff had been burbling away in the background, but in terms of the so-called disruptive fintech, the new providers of financial services, rather than the tech fintech new providers of IT to help the financial services industry as a whole, which has been going on forever, it was all unknown. That my show notes, from right in the middle of 2014, not only have to explain what fintech is, but what a podcast is, show us how fast our technical background knowledge has progressed in a mere handful of years. The revolution is proceeding super fast, hence the overall societal and cultural disruptions we are seeing. So, reading the notes from LFP001 in July 2014. When I told folks I was going to be launching a fintech podcast, the most common reply was, "What's fintech?" and "What's a podcast?" Hardly auspicious beginnings. Well, if you are here, then you know what a podcast is. It's an audio file you can listen to online or download and listen to offline. Even better, you can subscribe on your smartphone via an app such as iTunes or, my favourite, Pocket Casts. These will periodically check for updates and ensure that your commutes or long car drives are never as boring again. As to the tougher question, rather than diving in with a fintech interview, which is the theme of the London Fintech podcast, I thought it would be a good idea to start with an overview of fintech. In a recent survey, 9 out of 10 of my city chums hadn't heard of fintech in the sense it is now being used. In an even more informal survey at drinks with a group of 4 developers, none of them heard of fintech. So perhaps job 001 is to educate about the context and what is going on. To this end, in this first podcast, I cover 4 questions. What is fintech? How big is fintech? Why is it important? Why is it happening now? LFP002 covered innovation matchmaking, bringing, again to quote from the show notes at the time to capture an ethos almost entirely gone by now, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts of incumbents and innovators. It covers the challenges of selling into banks, Nothing new there then, and something that affects both the tech end as well as FS ends of fintech to this day. LFP145 lifted the bonnet on digital currencies with a deep dive into how Bitcoin worked. Interestingly, the accompanying picture was of the then Chancellor George Osborne using a Bitcoin ATM. I guess a picture of how the mighty, or at least those with great potential and self-belief, fall on two fronts. One now an editor of a free rag in London, the other long since abandoned even by students. And a few years later, I was walking past Google campus in London and saw them taking out their ATM machine crossed right in front of me. I recall a year or two ago mentioning in the New Year special that my daughter had returned from university to say that plenty of her physics chums were buying Bitcoin, as I recall, at near 20,000, roughly 3 times where it trades today. For me, the relative failure of Bitcoin per se is a sadness. The biggest macro and microeconomic problems out there is that governments cannot be trusted with money. $1 a century ago is worth a cent now. Money and its debasement has also, ever since money existed, gone hand in hand with militarism. If the populace ever take back control of the money, or if a government take money out of its own hands, then maybe we can stop non-stop state murdering. On the positive side, Osborne was responsible for creating a political/economic climate that enabled fintech to flourish in London. As we saw, it had been around for a decade and fitted in with centuries of Brits inventing weird and wonderful things. But it was a fertile field added to the aftermath of 2008 that made it bloom. Government is, of course, the ne plus ultra of centralisation, and ironically, Bitcoin's strength, its super-distributed nature at the start, soon inverted in the modern way of interconnection and oligopoly into being highly concentrated. As well as these angles, it also suffered by being orders of magnitude slower to clear, which meant that it could never really be used transactionally. Your coffee would be cold and the people behind you really pissed off waiting for their turn, while your tap and pay with a Bitcoin card actually, paid. A big deficiency for a payment mechanism. And as a store of value, it's just another computer thing, isn't it? Apart from melting ice caps. So back to 2014, the greatest hopes were for a new type of money removed from government's hands. It was a great experiment with plenty of learning lessons, but the opportunity is still out there. But Bitcoin by now is surely just another experiment in alt money. We await the next major leap forwards. Without disrupting money, one cannot truly disrupt FS. We will return to the relative demise of P2P later, but the ability of banks to create money out of thin air, put it this way, it makes FS much easier and much more profitable if you can create the financial bit out of thin air. It is not quite the case, but let's not get technical in a New Year special. But imagine one restaurant that has to buy all its food, another that can magic the food out of thin air for free. Which is the better business model? The answer to this simple question took Zopa over a decade to work through, although, as they recently became a restaurant that can create food out of thin air, I think their vote is now clear. Having said that, in terms of how hard can it be, as always, harder than you think, so wait and see how well they do their restaurant with free food compared to the incumbents who've been doing it for centuries and refined the art far, far more than any fintech in 2014 ever imagined. Back in the day, next to no fintech was founded by someone with FS experience. This gave them great abilities to think afresh, although they had not followed Sun Tzu's advice to know your enemy well. In later years, founders, let's take Nikolai at Revolut as an archetypal example, came from a hard FS background and thus had a far deeper understanding of what an amazingly good job FS does. I, for one, have never had a payment go wrong, touch wood, in about 40 years of using the industry. In LFP004, our guest was London's oldest fintech networking group, which went global and must have hosted more fintech presentations than anybody on the planet. In terms of its history, its founder Eddie George took us through their background, which dated to a pub in 2011. From small acorns, oak trees grow all around. I would also like to give my thanks to Eddie, whose kind inclusion of LFP episodes in the New Finance newsletter helped spread the word. Going round pubs is a great hobby, but it turns out that the interweb can be faster. We soon got on to FX with LFP005 on r5fx.com, which is still going strong. I often mention the fact that FS is a social construct whose form has varied widely over time, but which has always been shaped by the jelly mould of regulation. People nod when I say this, but it takes a time, decades, to really get this. As an example of how vital this is to success and survival in FS, let me quote from R5 FX's lead paragraph on their website today. Don't worry about the FS babble. If you don't know what the words mean, it doesn't matter. The word regulation is the only key word here. Quotes. R5 is a new institutional liquidity pool for ENDFs and EMFX, which focuses on leading the market change from voice to screen in BRICS and N11 currency trading. Upcoming regulation requires foreign exchange trading banks to drastically change their currency trading channels for the BRICS, N11 and other emerging market/NDF currency pairs. In LFP006, we looked at innovation in insurance, but interestingly, this was with an incumbent direct line, which is very telling. Insurance innovation wasn't to pick up until years later with the invention of reinsurance as a service by Munich Re, along with other variants by other insurers. Once again, this was solely due to regulation. If early banking fintechs avoided banking's monetary creation entirely, or tried to create their own currency, then being an insurtech without creating insurance yourself was far harder due to tighter regulation. LFP007 was entitled .coms to Fintechs, Lessons Learnt by Michael Nolte, 40 years plus as an entrepreneur, investor and angel. His final message was that the world of FS is changing, but that if the .com was anything to go by, what persists may be the less glamorous things. This seems to be broadly borne out. Shiny things like Bitcoin and P2P have not lived up to early promise. Bread and butter FX, pensions with Smart Pension or motor finance, Blue Motor Finance are a prime example. The episode refers to the difficulty of transmitting wisdom. People tend to treat it as information, but it is qualitatively and fundamentally different. 5 years after this episode, the CEO of a successful, glamorous fintech, who I respect, said to me that if he ever had to form another business again, it would be something unglamorous. In LFP008, we covered London's strengths and weaknesses as a place of fintech, many of which now remind me of London's strengths and weaknesses in 1600. Plus ça change. LFP009 was another FX firm, Quanji, also still going. Looking back, I'm surprised how many FX firms we covered. I'm partly surprised as it's years since I've seen them mentioned in any fintech coverage, partly no doubt as they drifted away from the fintech label. Certainly John Volomir, founder of R5FX, when he was last on the show, was talking about fintech not being helpful branding in their area and preferring a much more traditional branding. LFP010 was the 3,000 feet overview of alternative finance, both debt and equity. LFP011 covered GLI finance, a key player in equity funding many of the early P2Ps. Later shows covered P2P in depth, accelerators, whatever happened to those, US peer-to-peer, which was peer-to-peer gone large, and in LFP016, the first New Year's special at the start of 2015, where I foresaw a number of developments, although with hindsight, accurate, these took years rather than months to occur. They were 1. Less spin, 2. A shakeout, 3. Fintech maturing and breaking up into subsectors, 4. Groupthink in the subsectors, 5. New FS getting more solid. 1/3 of the episode title was Occupy Fintech. It's amazing how old some of those relatively recent events now seem. Occupy London itself had lasted from 2011 to 2012, and being part of the response and dissatisfaction after 2008 global financial crisis, its aftermath was very, very relevant to Fintech's foundation. Here is Wikipedia on Occupy London. Occupy London was a movement for social justice and real democracy in London, and part of the international Occupy movement. While some media described it as a, quote, anti-capitalist movement, in the statement written and endorsed by consensus by the Occupy Assembly in the first 2 days of the occupation, occupiers defined themselves as a movement working to create alternatives to a, quote, unjust and undemocratic system. Creating alternatives was absolutely the zeitgeist of early fintech, as well as improving social justice. Fast forward a few years, and most fintech has at best become just new pipes in the existing FS system, and the phrase social justice is now far more associated with membership and preaching for the church of the woke, where you don't need to do anything related to social justice whatsoever. You just have to divide the world into good and bad and tweet about it. Anyway, as part of the zeitgeist, I would hope that fintech could help real social justice, not just the virtue signalling that Ricky Gervais so recently excoriated in the Oscars. Some fintechs have focused on true social justice, although many have done so by improving access to finance. MarketInvoice, for example, one might not think of being involved in social justice, but its support for small businesses in new areas absolutely helps offset the corporatism that keeps most people wage slaves at Mexico. Crowdfunding has been one of the successes of fintech in the UK and another modest conduit towards improving microeconomic possibilities, which not only lead to increased employment, but increased employment in smallcos. It is one where the always overactive regulator has most dropped the ball, in my view. B shares should have been banned from the start. Equity should be equitable. B shares are rather like it being a peasant in feudal Japan. The A shareholders are allowed to practice their sword techniques on you and chop your head off with impunity. Conrad Ford's funding options appeared in LFP145. It's all very well that zillions of banks and zillions of fintechs exist, but this multiplicity of choices creates a huge problem for simple businesses who simply don't have the time to go and get a PhD on the landscape of FS every time they need finance. Payments has unsurprisingly been a recurring theme for the LFP, and unsurprisingly, as along with creating money, there's only really moving it around and where it is moved to that is the basic infrastructure of financial services. Payments is something that crosses FS and fintech, although given the zillions of dollars moved around, it's a rare fintech that participates and creates a new incumbent. We've been very fortunate to have one or two on the show of late, but once again these are unglamorous names well out of the mainstream media and social media focuses. Bought by many were our first startup insurtech on the show back in 2015 and are now the granddaddy of the London insurtech scene. David Stevenson made the case in 2015 also for fintech as an alternative asset class, and indeed, once again with the delay of several years, we've seen this extended to many unexpected areas. My mind flicks back to wrapping up trade finance as an investable class in 2019. Back to FS being simply creating money and moving it from supply pools to demand pools. As P2P and every other sector found, incumbent FS, especially on the buy side, i.e. investment side, owns the pools. Whether you are fundraising equity, financing P2P, where increasingly most everyone went down the institutional funding route with the exception of Ratesetter, or doing trade finance, this connecting pools of capital turned out to be the thing. In 2015 we covered non-banking with APS, important but unglamorous. This whole model was later taken up in the wave of sexier app banks, which somehow added glamour to an app based solely on a rebranded MasterCard, only years later transitioning to proper bankdom. App banks have been left with the glamour, but also the poor economics of something that was started with a money-losing business model. Just as with Zopa, they then find themselves faced with outbanking the banks. Good luck with that one. Remittances is a huge market and important subset of payments which we dipped into with World Remit in 2015. One reason that fintech took off so well was that initially there was a light touch regulation. With Osborne's demise, the ever-expanding FS regulators had their leash released and expanded massively, taking a ludicrous 2 years or so to regulate some P2Ps, which at the time were around a dozen or so people. The problems of regulations being a new square peg was highlighted as far back as 2015 by Jonathan Siegel. Indeed, they became even more than this. By 2019 they had assumed a function that they had had in big FS for many years, i.e. simply to protect the incumbents under the guise of protecting the populace. Recent changes in P2P regulation, for example, led to many UK P2Ps exiting the market completely and, of course, the large players welcoming the changes. They would, wouldn't they? It's a microcosm of the world at large. Banks were slow to get going with this whole fintech lark. Nothing new there then, and in 2015, Anna Herrera of the Financial News, now with the Dow Jones in New York, highlighted the 7 strategies that the most advanced banks were following with fintech at large, i.e. digital as a whole, in 2015. These days, no bank would dare say it does not have a strategy for digital. In 2016, Ben Luckett of Aviva joined us to describe how an incumbent sets about corporate venturing to expose themselves directly to the new world of innovation. By 2016, the realpolitik of fintech was starting to spread on the street, the reality behind the all-too-prevalent hype and bullshit of the fanboys. And Rusbe Butcher, founder of City Falcon, joined us in LFP043 to discuss what really goes down. As the market matured, issues of how you scale up and get more robust, yet preserve your culture, entered the equation in LFP044. In LFP050, we constructed the, lies really, around so-called peer-to-peer FX, quotes, more talked about than done. As I noted in the show notes, quotes, in a recent article, Nick England, founder of VFX and a 15-year veteran of the FX markets, said that TransferWise was, quotes, smoke and mirrors, unquote, and that their main innovation was around marketing. Interestingly, back to the recording of history being a challenge even in the digital age, when I just looked up this article, it no longer existed. This rather reminded me of the challenge of finding the, at the time, criticism of corporate governance, which entered the UK in 1992. It's super hard to find it anymore. History remains written by the victors. In the middle of 2016, I discussed two topics which would last far longer than either of us expected at the time with Giles Andrews, father of Zopa. Do we need a Fintech 2.0? And secondly, what impact will Brexit have? On the last, we're still waiting. This episode was appropriately followed by a discussion with senior commentator and grand fromage of UK economics and FS worlds John Kay on how Fintech could become far larger by reforming FS. His recent book, Other People's Money, Masters of the Universe or Servants of the People. And indeed, this episode remains a reference point for understanding the role of FS and what new can be done. 3.5 years on, I think one can say that Fintech has not managed to reform FS, but has, at best, become a new part of it. All revolutions become what they seek to overthrow. Discuss writing on one side of the paper only. The LFP has been privileged to have some brilliant sponsors over the years, and my long-term, super successful sponsor, Smart Pension, are perhaps the only Fintech to truly knock the ball out of the park and rise to the top of their market, auto-enrolments, in pensions in this case. Only a little over 3 years ago, Will Wynne was sharing with us how to get 75,000 clients in under 2 years. Now they probably have something more like 75 billion or some such. As well as being a super firm, they had the sense to enter a new market as opposed to trying to innovate in very old markets. So remember that, boys and girls. Look out for new markets. Few and far between, but much easier than trying to innovate in thousands of years old markets. Talking of changes, naturally we touched on open banking several times, but once again it was much regulated, much hyped and much frothed about. Only last year did we start to see things we might actually call useful emerging from it, and this more on the SME side. Artificial intelligence / machine learning has emerged as an important area of Fintech to absorb, although once again covered in froth and foam. Tristan Fletcher is a super expert who doesn't buy the bullshit, but has deep experience in this area. He joined us first in late 2016 and again in 2019, and both his appearances are a must know about. In passing, for those of you like me whose podcast app leaves much to be desired when searching for old episodes, don't forget that www.londonfintechpodcast.com contains a bonefully constructed and always up-to-date index page of all episodes. December 2016 was a good month, covering Blue Motor Finance, who are super rare, profitable and super successful fintech being based just outside the M25, where they have a lower cost base whilst still having easy access to London and FS, something other relatively rare regional fintechs never really managed to balance. Furthermore, Tom Blumfeld laid out his vision for Monzo, all fine and dandy, but we're still waiting. Another example of everything takes far longer than you ever imagined. Let's put to one side our dot-to-dot guide to the main strands of fintech, and before leaping ahead to round up with 2019, I'd like to mention my deep dives into FS policy. I was super fortunate to have as guests Lord Turner, the last head of the FSA, and Sir Paul Tucker, former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. Money is created by laws and FS is created by laws and regulation, and it's important to see where these come from and the mentality of those who have held these positions. Turner spoke about the super long policy cycles, from ideas being generated by academics and then lying as seeds awaiting fertile ground and watering by a politician with drive who needs their fruit. He gave the example of the academics in World War II who thought that maybe it would be a great idea if the state didn't run everything, as it pretty much did in the war. These weren't implemented until Thatcher came along in the 80s, as anyone who's noticed the zeitgeist in the UK election or in the Democratic primaries in the US last year may have spotted. The wheel seems to be coming full circle, and as a great comment I saw recently said, we don't need half-baked 19th century ideas to solve 21st century problems. State centralism, aka so-called socialism in the US, or bad old Marxism in the Labour Party leadership, is being pushed once again upon the people, by people who have no experience of business. Business, as you may have noticed, creates every product we use in our lives and creates all the wealth of a country. Those of us around when the Berlin Wall came down would never have imagined that not too far in the future some idiots would be suggesting that the state, which is already around half of expenditure in most European countries, be made even bigger and ever more central and own yet more stuff. as if it were any good at doing anything in the first place. Some people even want to nationalise broadband, o tempora o mores. If one of the 21st century problems, which you won't solve with 19th century techniques, is the rise of corporatism, unelected and unaccountable power in a handful of companies worldwide, the other is regulation. Indeed, the former, corporatism, flows from the latter, regulation. One point Turner made was that we should aim for much simpler regulation, the core of which should be more capital, and also that we, quotes, need a small number of powerful regulations rather than micro-supervision. Sir Paul Tucker echoed these points, alongside outlining his magnum opus, Unelected Power, the quest for legitimacy in central banking and the regulatory state. In the Punch and Judy show that passes for democracy in the US and the UK, attention is never given to how much power has leaked away from the electable into unaccountable and unelected hands. The FCA's recent regulations on peer-to-peer are as unelected and as unaccountable as the pronouncements of any medieval monarch ever were. However, the FCA have won over the monarch in that they are their own judge and jury too. It's not just the FCA. That organisation just happens to be closest to home for us. There are hundreds of regulators in the country costing astronomical sums and impacting the market left, right and centre. We truly live, as de Tocqueville foresaw almost 2 centuries ago, in a soft despotism. No tanks on the streets, but countless extra-parliamentary barons ruling over you and I. And if we displease them, we will soon be fined or jailed. The Athenians, if they had copyrighted the word democracy, would not license it for our use. Mind you, they wouldn't license it to us even if we had 0 regulators, as voting for Punch or Judy every 5 years is nothing like what they were up to. Soft tyranny was the theme of last year's New Year special. I'm more sanguine a year later, with the great dictator gone and political sanity restored. Although we still need a reformation in the opposition, unchallenged government isn't good. However, judging by the narcissistic clowns putting themselves forward, we have about as much chance of a well thought through and reasoned opposition as the Democrats suddenly deciding to work out why they actually lost in 2016. One problem that we all suffer from around the world is the poor calibre of politician. This only ever gets worse as the mainstream media dumbs down coverage and treats them all with thinly veiled contempt. You need to have near psychopathically thick skin these days. 'Twas not always thus. To take some 19th century examples, both Peel and Gladstone got double firsts at Oxford in greats, which is classics, and mathematics. Stunning achievements. Can you think of anybody of that intelligence in politics today? As Gladstone kept a diary, which covered all the books he read, we know that he read over 20,000 books in his lifetime. No wonder we ruled the waves. Still, Boris speaks some Greek, so maybe we might at least get back some fishing rights, if not all the oceans. So where are we now with FinTech? Let's wrap up with touching on some of the most interesting episodes from 2019. But before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all you listeners out there, otherwise there would have been no point in doing all this. I hope you've learned a lot and had some entertainment as well, and wish you all not just a very happy new year, but a very happy new decade. And I'd also like to thank my brand partner for the podcast, Smart Pension, who are fast, secure and free. Check out their UK workplace pensions at autoenrolment.co.uk. Innovation continues apace, although more in ecological niches these days, compared to the early years of FinTech, which attempted to replace banking by disintermediated P2P models and to reinvent money per se. So much to my surprise, although to be honest it's very hard work to find the pearls amongst the thousands of incoming emails, 2019's LFPs, coming at the end of a decade of innovation, covered a whole host of new innovations and great content. The first non-New Year special episode of 2019 covered Cormac Leach's litigation crowdfunding and was followed by securitizing trade finance to make it an investable asset class with Christopher Gugelman, CEO of TradeTech. It's truly impressive that London continues to innovate. Smart Pension had a strategic investment from JP Morgan, and my friends at Blue Motor Finance were hailed by the FT as the fastest growing company in the whole of Europe. So there really are true successes out there, and clearly the best thing you can do for your chances of success is to be a sponsor of the LFP. Blue Motor Finance's CTO Charlie Barker joined me in LFP145 for a great special episode covering the whole history of tech from the Second World War to the present. In LFP126, Max Rafaga, CEO of Finimize, discussed whether FinTech can fill the financial advice gap. Once again, regulation has had entirely foreseeable consequences. Putting in far more costly training for financial advisors has meant that the price of financial advice has gone through the roof, and consequently far fewer people can afford it. In LFP127, Tom McGillicuddy, the CEO of Ticker, discussed impact and ethical investment in the fintech age. In LFP128, Richard Council of Stable discussed hedging soft commodity prices, and in LFP129, Tim Levine, CEO of Augmentum, discussed the innovation of patient VC capital via an investment trust, not LLP fund. We continued this theme of non-stop innovation until and beyond the middle of the year. Peter Briffett talking about fintech for social good, Occupy Fintech Lives, and income streaming. In LFP132, we looked at property project finance and fintech with Mike Bristow. Louise Hill joined us to discuss fintech for parents and kids. And in LFP136, I finally sat down with a heavyweight reg-techer, Evgeny Likoded of Clausebatch, who reformed my ideas of what data could be. Not just bits, but more like a series of toppling dominoes. Astonishingly, and I'm grateful to my show notes, qua diary, otherwise I wouldn't have believed this 2019 being a year of considerable innovation, LFP137 took the all-time biscuit for sci-fi tech. Two-way interactive responsive digital humans, think Red Dwarf's Holly, with Marek Zwiefka-Sibley of Trillions. That this business grew out of a pensions provider, yet another word of praise for Smart Pension, showed me more than anything how FS has changed over the decades. When I started in the city, the pensions department was perhaps on the bottom but one rung of the prestige ladder, with only private clients below. Now, 21st century pensions births an amazing leap forwards in human-machine interaction. As I've mentioned, not many fintechs dominate their sector, let alone in one of the biggest markets in the world. Prime Revenue was formed in 2003 and is the largest non-bank supplier of supply chain finance in the world. They facilitate more than $200 billion of payments per annum for 20,000 clients. Peter Cook shares his lessons in LFP 139. Innovation continued in LFP 140 with Freddie Kelly, who has created only the fourth UK credit bureau. Notwithstanding all this innovation, the incumbent players remain super important, and LFP 142 covered capital markets fintech and grown-up digital FS with Martin Boyd of FIS. One key takeaway here was that digital in wholesale FS markets means two things. Firstly, access to data when it's high volume and highly regulated, using data lakes, moving data into a form from which it can be accessed in many ways. Second, lowering costs, adding AI and ML upon this, and fixing breaks in the operational flows. Michael Pearson has taken the company's house data on 100 fintechs and analysed many dimensions. In LFP 143, he joined us to discuss profitability. The standout points that were, of the 100 fintechs that he examined, only 6 are currently making a profit. Oak North, TransferWise, iWalker, ClearScore, Lendinvest and Blue Motor Finance. Furthermore, the patterns in loss-making fintech were that 85% were reporting increased losses, and for those fintechs over 5 years old, 78% were reporting increased losses. So there's much work to be done. In the last episode of the decade, Sam O'Connor of Coconut discussed one way of getting to Fintech 2.0, the innovative combination of different silos. So, to wrap up briefly. 1. An astonishing amount of innovation marks the past decade, which continues unabated. 2. Everything takes far longer than expected. 3. Monetizing is clearly not easy. Why do we see this pattern? Surely innovation should, prima facie, be a successful business model. I feel it is, and it would be in FS, but FS is madly overregulated and at a minutiae level. I am left rather in the camp of the greybeards on this one, Turner and Tucker, but also before them Friedman and Hayek. The government, or these days, is outsourced, off-balance sheet dominions, distorts the markets to our peril and in the favour of the oligopolists. As Hayek pointed out in the super important Road to Serfdom, in passing, the Conservative Party gave 1.5 tonnes of its very rare paper allowance in the war for more copies to be printed. Profit is a signal which enables countless millions or billions of people to self-organise their business lives without central planning. Furthermore, central planning and complex regulation never succeed, something that explains the, quotes, mystery, unquotes, of so-called below-trend continental European GNP growth. Anyway, in reviewing the past decade, I'm amazed at how much has happened, how quickly it's gone, and, in the case of innovation, how it keeps happening. Where is this all going? Stay tuned and find out in 2020. Live long and prosper. Thanks for listening. If you have consulting, advisory/non-exec or media needs in the FS or fintech space, get in touch with me at mike@londonfintechpodcast.com.
sit in a bender all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moon ride, watching a happy moon ride. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. The city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me, 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 watch the firelight